Hi, my name is Winslaya and welcome to my video going over my 10 general tips for playing on the new content that we're getting in the Archon Prophecy expansion and the free Griffin update for Age of Wonders 4, both of which are coming out on August 12th. Big thank you to Paradox Interactive and Triumph Studios for sending me a free press key for Age of Wonders 4 Archon Prophecy and for sponsoring this video. I've been working a lot on this video and I'm very excited to share my insights with you all. My first tip is to use the Order variant of Visions of Promise with early game rush builds like Prolific Swarmers plus High Culture plus the Tome of Necromancy to rush down players using the new Architect Culture and other late game focused builds. Generally speaking, the Architect Culture starts off quite weak but becomes very powerful in the late game. Since it is new, I think it's reasonable to expect that a lot of players will tend to use it for quite a while, but there is a window where it is quite vulnerable to early game combats. Its tier 1 units tend to die a lot in auto combat and can be a little bit tricky to use in manual combats, so they have to pick their early game fights a little bit more carefully than other factions. If you use the new Visions of Promise with the Order Affinity questline, you can get a second city before turn 10, and that is quite powerful when you compare it to other society traits and even the other vision quests in Visions of Promise. I found that the Materium Vision of Promise takes a lot longer to complete, and while the nature version of Visions of Promise doesn't take as long as the Materium one, the combat is quite a bit tougher than the Order one, and you have to spend a few turns founding a city after you clear the ruin, whereas the Order Promise just happens after you defeat the army in the city. While you can use any of the new prophecy traits like Vision of Destiny or Vision of Ruin to give yourself new questlines with powerful rewards, the Order Affinity variant of Visions of Promise is easily my favorite. Not only is it fast to complete, it gives you a free paladin unit on the first turn of the game. Generally, the Vision of Promises are a little bit more early game focused, whereas the Visions of Destiny are more mid game focused, and the Visions of Ruin are more late game focused. My next tip is to use the Mighty Meek enchantment from the Tome of the Beacon to get tier 1 and tier 2 units that hit like trucks. The devs recently changed it so tier 2 units can get the benefit from Mighty Meek, and there are a lot of really good tier 2 units for you to put Mighty Meek on. For example, the Magelock, who has attacks that bypass enemy defenses, will be able to deal a lot more damage to all the units that are in the game, but specifically it'll be able to kill off the higher tier units even more effectively than it previously was able to, and it will be viable a lot later in the game. The Scrap Hermit is one of my favorite units in the game. It is a really strong animal unit with self-healing, and it benefits a lot from getting the extra damage off of Mighty Meek because after it gets that, it kind of does everything. It can tank, it can deal damage, it can heal itself, so it doesn't need any other units in order to perform well. It's also worth noting that the tier 2 evolving spiders now can get Mighty Meek on top of the fact that they can get Slip Away, making them just generally a lot better across the board and making combining Tome of the Beast with Tome of Evolution and Tome of the Beacon a lot more viable now. It is also worth noting here that when you use the reworked Call of the Wild animal spell in water, you can now choose between units that are either amphibious and can go back and forth from land and water, or units that are strictly just for water combat and can only move in water on the strategic layer. So that allows you to better choose what the army's roles will be and how that army will maneuver on the strategic layer and then in combat as well. And you can also use the reworked Call Wild Animal spell in Ashlands to get a good chance to either spawn in the Scrap Hermit or the relatively new Pyre Moth unit, which are some of my favorite tier 2 units in the game. And one last fun fact about Mighty Meek is that since primal summons count as tier 2 units, they can get the bonus from Mighty Meek and can absolutely delete any unit in the early game, mid game, or late game. My next tip is to use the new Astrological Diviners Society trait with the new Architect culture to rush early research production. If you are able to recruit or summon units during the 10th, 20th, or 30th turn, they will be a lot better. But more importantly, if you can get into fights on those turns, your units are almost guaranteed to get critical strikes on every attack they take. While I listed the 10th, 20th, and 30th turn, this effect works on any turn that ends with the number 0. When I am playing the new Architect culture, I like getting their unique knowledge buildings up as soon as possible, but they are most vulnerable in the early game, so I generally recommend you don't over focus on research too much in the early game so that you can have the economy to build and maintain armies. Taking Astrological Diviners means you can focus a little bit less on early game research production, but at the same time, it's kind of what the architects are good at, so you want to be focusing quite heavily on it without, obviously opening yourself up to getting conquered too early in the game. I have been hearing some people on Discord say that the entire architect culture seems like it's made to scale really well in the late game, which means you kind of have to rush them or lose. And that's kind of like the Stormbringer unit, which I believe was introduced in the Primal Fury DLC, where we got the Primal culture. It is worth noting here that the special interaction of getting knowledge when you complete city structures and special province improvements on turns that end with the number 0 is quite powerful and something that will allow you to get your research done a lot quicker in the game, but it's not strong enough that you want to just ignore your research production. I think this is just something that will make that snowball happen a little bit quicker, and therefore something that you want to pay attention to and try and rush out buildings on the correct turn to get just a little bit knowledge earlier and therefore unlock technologies a little bit quicker. My next tip is to use the new Ancient Wonders, which are Archon Observatories, to get a free level up on your ruler, plus the ability to turn a city's production into research and the ability to recruit both lesser light spirits and the tier 3 light spirits through the Rally of the Liege mechanic. The Archon Observatory has 3 different sub-variants, one of which is called the Divination Dome. They all have the same event chain, so the rewards from this one is the same as the Archon Oculus. While the Crystal Dwellings in the last DLC gave you the ability to turn your city's production into research, you don't have to jump through as many hoops or as many steps if you want to get this interaction through the new Ancient Wonders we're getting in Archon Prophecies, which in turn means you can get this ability, this effect a lot earlier in the game. With that being said, clearing this new Ancient Wonder is a relatively tough silver fight, so you want to come prepared. My next tip is, if you enjoy playing multiplayer, I highly recommend you get True Strike from the Tome of Discipline early to discourage your opponents from taking the Tome of Prophecies. This will allow you to preemptively prepare a counter to the precognition buff from that Tome of Prophecies. Precognition is a new buff that allows units to avoid a single attack from enemy damage unless it's countered by True Strike. Precognition blocks attacks that always hits, AoEs, spells, and high damaging single shots like charge strikes. This leads me to believe that precognition will be very popular in multiplayer, and if you take Tome of Discipline, make sure that you use more ranged units than you usually do. Due to the best early source of True Strike being only for range attacks on battle mages, ranged units, and support units, melee will have a lot harder of a time dealing with precognition than your ranged units with True Strike. Bypassing the precognition does not remove it from a unit, so keep that in mind when you're planning out your actions in combat. There are three main sources of precognition in the Tome of Prophecies: Prescient Circlet's enchantment, the Battle Divination spell, and the Oracle unit's skills. Interestingly, the Oracle has a skill that gives True Strike in an AoE, which can be applied to melee units, meaning melee units can bypass precognition with that special interaction, and that the Tome of Prophecies can be used to counter another player who is also using the Tome of Prophecies. My next tip is to use the new landmark, the Fountain of Creation, to get access to a lot of early game dispels. This dispel does make units wet, so if your opponent is using this enchantment, try to get access to frost damage and or lightning damage so that you can make the best use out of the fact that they will be weak to those damage channels if they have the wet debuff on them. And what you want to try and do is also avoid making units or using units that deal fire damage. If your opponent is able to apply wet to its own units, they will be a little bit resistant to fire damage. One nice thing about these unique regions is that you can see them through the fog of war, so building toward them is somewhat easy to do in the early game if you just take a little bit of extra time to look for those outlines in the fog of war. And since there are no fights necessary to gain these bonuses, you can get them quite early in the game if they happen to spawn near you or you go out and find them relatively early on. I've had 2 regions or landmarks connected to my capital in the first 20 turns of the game, and when you're able to do that, it not only really boosts your economy, but it gives you access to really good units relatively early in the game, and that can allow you to really snowball those benefits to take out enemies that spawned further away from landmarks. My next tip is to get mass access to AoE cleanses by combining Cleansing Rain from the Tome of Prosperity with the new support units we're getting in the free update and the DLC. Lesser Light Spirits and the Cultivator are new tier 1 support units, giving you early units that can get a lot of value out of the Cleansing Rain enchantment. Unlike the Firebomb enchantment, which is from Tome of the Dragons and does damage based on the tier of the unit using it, the impact of Cleansing Rain is the same for all units with the enchantment, regardless of their tier. It is easy to miss that Cleansing Rain not only can be used defensively to remove negative debuffs from your own units, but it can also be used offensively to remove buffs from your opponents. Arguably, it is better to use it to strip enemy buffs than it is to remove debuffs from your own units, but that really depends on what other sources you have of debuff cleansing and what debuffs you have on your own units, as well as what buffs your enemy has on their own units. My next tip is to hoard magic materials regardless of what faction you are playing. If you are playing the new Architect culture, they need Wonderstone from magic materials in order to build monuments, which allow them to get their main unit interaction, Affinity Incarnate, and you really want to get that online as quickly as possible if you are playing the Architect culture. If you are playing against them, denying your opponents the strong interactions that they get from Affinity Incarnate is almost more important than getting them on your own units, because that will make it so that they are unable to really clear the map efficiently, and you're going to be able to buy yourself more time to get your own build online. The Architect spell Resilient Incarnate is pretty overpowered after you get a couple stacks of Infinity Incarnate. It says that it will baseline just give +1 defense and +1 resistance for 1 turn in a 1 hex radius. The fact that it's only for 1 turn means you won't have to worry about this additional defense for very long, but the fact that it can be an additional +1 defense and +1 resistance per stack of Infinity Incarnate will allow this to become pretty ridiculous relatively early in the game. You'll be able to significantly boost your defense and resistance on units for a single turn for a relatively cheap spell. It's only 10 mana and 15 casting points, making it quite efficient once you're able to get some Affinity Incarnate stacks online. The stacks of Infinity Incarnate do interact with a lot of other aspects of the unit roster that the Arctic culture gets access to, but it also can just generally boost the damage of all units that the Arctic culture controls. So you want to keep that in mind when you are fighting them in general, that the longer you wait, the stronger they'll become. So in reality, while denying them magic materials is what you want to aim for in the short term, you really do not want to leave them alone for long, because eventually they will just become incredibly powerful and a lot harder to fight. And that's why you kind of want to go on the offense against them as early as possible. But yeah, if you can deny them magic materials in the meantime, you probably should try to. My next tip is to use the new Battlesaint classes on your heroes and to not use it on your main ruler. They will be able to create unbreakable frontlines and or block paths to your ranged DPS units, but I found that when I put my ruler on the Battlesaint class that they took a lot of damage and that I lost a lot of early units in auto combats. The class is really strong in manual combats, but I found that the AI struggles a little bit with using its abilities efficiently. And when you are in combat, you really don't want your ruler to get too far forward, as it could get picked off early in a combat, denying you access to spell casting and making it so that you have to wait a few turns for your ruler to return in your capital. The Battlesaint is designed to be relatively close to the front line, so it's not a great class for you to put on your main ruler, but I do like a lot of the special interactions with the fervor stacks and how they can allow you to either make that unit, the hero unit, a lot stronger, or so that they can like heal and or make other units stronger that are relatively near the Battlesaint. My last tip for you in this video is to use skeletons more often than you used to, because they now have access to an early source of resurgence, and the rest of the Tome of Necromancy is exceptionally strong in the current build of the game. The fact that skeletons now get resurgence at champion rank makes them easier to keep alive, but you still may end up disbanding a few of them, because when they end up resurging, they need to then spend a few turns healing up before they can start the beginning of combat with enough HP to be used efficiently. But they also have a really big mana upkeep that you want to keep in mind with the calculation on whether or not you want to disband a skeleton or not, especially once they have a few enchantments on them. It is quite easy to underestimate how powerful it is to be able to reanimate skeletons where your armies are currently clearing. I know some people really don't like putting experience on tier 1 skeletons. They feel like there are better units to be able to put that power on, but when you consider that they can take the benefit of Mighty Meek and the fact that they can be just sent where your armies are currently clearing, they become a lot more justifiable in my mind, because you can't build units wherever your armies are clearing. Generally, if they're far away, it might take a long time for units that you build in your cities to catch up, and every once in a while you want to send units off away from your heroes to try and clear the map, and if you don't have a hero with them, then you won't be able to summon in most magic based units. But skeletons, they work differently. They just need racial units to be defeated in combat for you to reanimate them and continue clearing pretty aggressively. It is also worth considering that if you take the Tome of Necromancy, you will have the ability to at least research the spell Necrotize, which does both frost damage and blight damage, as well as summons in a new unit on your side of the combat after the unit that Necrotized dies. The new Archon units are weak to both frost and blight damage, so with the Tome of Necromancy you will be able to clear out the new locations a little bit faster, as well as some of the stacks that have celestial units in them as well. Being able to collect souls for resurrecting heroes early and create undead units should not be underestimated too. Having access to a large stockpile of souls is very useful at any point in the game, as resurrecting heroes with mana is very expensive and reanimating them gives the heroes the undead tag, allowing them to be revived in combat by necromancers, and that's a very useful ability. That's everything I have for you in this video. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you around and have a good rest of your day.